and wait a couple of minutes for a few more folks to join us before I get started. Just a couple of notes by way of introduction for what it is I hope to achieve today and in future classes where we discuss essay writing in English courses. First year English courses are perhaps the only classes most of you will take that focus on writing. And writing in particular within the discipline of English. I recognize that most of you are from outside the Faculty of Arts and are pursuing studies in areas quite distinct from English. But I think some of the material I want to cover today can be very helpful for all of you in whatever it is you're studying. If we keep in mind the fact that what I want to talk about today in terms of general essay structure is applicable to any writing you undertake in the future that requires constructing a solid argument that makes use of primary texts as evidence. In English courses, the evidence that you're going to, the evidence that you are going to appeal to support your argument is extracted from the literary text that we're asking you to read. That's your chief source of evidence. This is not a research course per se, so I'm not expecting most of you to go out and do additional research. My chief interest is in developing your own capacities as young critics of literary texts. That said, how does one gather appropriate evidence for the opinions that they express in their thesis statements and essays? That's really where we're going to get at this year. What I want to do today is a kind of general introduction to the basic structure of the essays that I anticipate reading from you over the course of the year. And then I'm going to go, but what I really want to do is make sure we're all on the same page for what an essay looks like and what it actually does. So I'm going to start with a kind of general overview of what the essay is and how one starts putting it together, with apologies to those of you who already have a good handle on this. What I'm going to say today may be familiar territory for a number of you, but I want us all to be on the same page when it comes to constructing an essay according to a set of expectations that are outlined in the MLA handbook, the Modern Language Association handbook, which I put a link up just this morning for all students in this class. So that's what I want to do today. Is everyone with me on this? I'm going to do a screen share and just remind you, I hope I'm going to do a screen share. Yes, it's going to work for me this morning. Great. Of what resources are available on eClass. Okay. So here we are in eClass. Is this visible to everybody? I have put this link up here at the top of the eClass page, this URL link to the Modern Language Association Handbook 9th edition. This is the text with which I'll be working this year. You don't need to familiarize yourself with the entire text, but if you click on here, and this is what you're going to find. I'm just going to move my window over there. There's a very useful table of contents to start off this text. If you have any questions about proper formatting, this is where you're going to turn first. And we're going to work our way through chapter 1 of the MLA book, formatting your research essay, and then skip ahead to chapter 5. Excuse me, it's a long book. Chapter 5, the list of works cited. This is what we're going to focus on today, next Friday. Could everyone turn their mutes on, please? Again, I'm getting a little bit of background noise. Feel free to unmute yourself at any point if you have any questions. But so here's the MLA guide, and this is your chief resource for any questions you have about how to start writing an essay, what a thesis statement looks like, what a bibliography or works cited, as the MLA calls it, looks like, and so on. Lots and lots of advice here. So this is a very useful resource that I hope you will turn to before coming to me with any specific questions after our initial conversations about essay structure. So I'm not going to turn to this right now. I'm going to go to this. Now, this is my document. I'm going to put this up on the e-class after today's conversation, okay? But this is where I'm going to start with a definition of the essay itself and its basic structure and form, and then into some advice about thesis statements, quotations, and works cited, and then we'll back up next week and revisit some of this material in more detail. Please do interrupt me at any point with any questions or concerns you might have. But just a general reminder of what the essay is in terms of form and structure. Essay, of course, is a word borrowed from the French that simply means to try or to attempt, to essay, a written endeavor, an assay, or an approach. An essay takes an approach to the texts under consideration and makes an argument about that text based on a careful reading and the application of a particular argument to the text as evidence. I'll get to this in more detail. An essay is always analytical or critical, not simply descriptive. When you get your first assignments back from me and I cross out a line and say, this is simply plot summary, or this is simply descriptive, you are simply repeating what the text already tells me, and hence that's irrelevant to your essay. What I'm trying to suggest there is that what you always need to keep in mind is that when you provide me with a reminder of what a particular text says, a poem or an essay or a short story, you're only doing that to set up a critical take on your reiteration of what the text says. So an essay always takes up a critical position, which, as we know now, is not simply negative or fault finding. By a critical position, I mean you are positioning yourself in relation to the text and extracting from it bits and pieces of evidence to make an argument about something that the text does not explicitly say, but you believe can be is a way of understanding and enriching our understanding of the text. We'll get to that. Okay, so an essay is always analytical. Textual analysis is critical reading. You examine a text by, for example, engaging with its assumptions, its presuppositions, what is the lines, as we say, with what it doesn't say explicitly, but with what it implies, for example, or what it presupposes. So an essay always considers a text's historical context, that is, the other texts, the other opinions and conventions it works with, and that it assumes its reader has a knowledge of. When we get to the two works of poetry on Monday that I've asked you to read, I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of poem an elegy is and what kind of poem a dramatic monologue is. That is historical context that helps us understand what those poems are doing. Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard is working within the literary conventions of the elegy, the poem of mourning and loss. Whereas Browning's My Last Duchess is working within the conventions that he himself invents for the dramatic monologue. the poem spoken by a single speaker in a highly dramatic context. Those are historical and generic contexts that help us read the poems within a certain literary history. That's what I mean by analytical analysis that demonstrates an awareness of what the generic, the formal attributes of these texts are, but also how they work with those various literary conventions and perhaps provide us with a twist on them or say something interesting about them. So you're not simply engaging with what is said in a text, in a critical essay, but also how it is said, a focus on the language of the text. So not just what is said, but how it is said and what makes that how interesting or exciting or perplexing, okay? So a close attention to the language and the rhetoric of the texts. That is the text's linguistic persuasiveness. Rhetoric is the language of persuasion, the ability of the text to sway or move or convince a reader. What does this text do to you as a reader? It might excite you. It might disappoint you. It might bore you. It might persuade you of a position that you didn't formerly take, okay? So I'm asking you to think about what the text does to position you as a reader with relation to it. An analytical or a critical essay provides analysis or evaluation versus mere description or plot summary. Sometimes plot summary, that is revisiting the text and reminding your reader, that's me, of what happens is necessary. But you always want to take a critical position with relation to what happens in a text. Okay, so an essay is analytical. It's critical. That is, it expresses, here's my point C, an opinion, okay? Your thesis statement needs to express an opinion. It cannot be simply descriptive. It doesn't simply tell me what happens, but it takes up a position in relation to what happens. So I'm happy to see you insert your distinctive voice into your essay and to use the word I as often as you need to. I'm a little bit more skeptical of the use of the word we, because when you use the word we, you're involving me in that. You're assuming that I also hold your opinion, but do feel free to use the personal pronoun I throughout your essays. In this essay, I will argue that is a great way to open an essay. And so I'm looking for your distinctive voice, a subject position in your essay. Supported by reference to the text. And I'll talk a little bit about how you use the text as evidence to support your opinion in just a few minutes. There are no necessarily right or wrong or final readings of literary text, but there are strong and weak readings. Do you actually read the text properly? And do you summon evidence from the text to support your evidence in a persuasive way? Do you present me with a strong reading as opposed to a weak reading? So if there are no necessarily right or wrong responses to literary text, for example, a poem or a short story or an essay, a satirical essay, there are effective and fluent ways of interpreting and presenting your argument as opposed to weak, unpersuasive, and poorly structured ways. Okay, just a general introduction to the essay. And yes, your close readings, although they're very brief assignments, do need to be presented in proper essay format. That is an introduction, a middle, a conclusion, a definitively articulated thesis statement, and a kind of closure that is achieved by the end of the essay. I am looking for that. although you have an opportunity in your rewrite to strengthen the structure of your essay based on my comments. Okay, the structure of an essay. I'm going to go back to Aristotle here, the great classical Greek philosopher, because Aristotle said every work of comedy or tragedy has to have a certain structure. And it seems so obvious that it doesn't warrant mentioning, but I'm going to do it anyways because it's not so obvious. It's very, very difficult to structure an essay effectively. An essay needs a beginning, that is an introduction and a thesis. I'll talk about thesis statements in just a moment. It needs a middle, that is the development of your introduction, an argument by example and through detail, and then of course an end, a conclusion, a summary, perhaps pointing outside the end. So this is what we call unity of presentation. Your conclusion would revisit your introduction. You all know this from high school and other classes you might have taken here at the university, but it should not simply reiterate verbatim, word for word, your introduction. It should.
Never mind. I do have a class.
Okay, so someone maybe needs to mute themselves. I hear a little bit of background noise. Please put on your mute unless you have a question for me. Remind yourself of what Cantor did in his essay. He returned to the beginning of it, but he didn't simply repeat what he said in his opening paragraph. He pointed to other ways of taking his argument. Conclusions are difficult to write, and I acknowledge that at the outset, and I'm going to hopefully give you some useful advice on how to rethink your conclusion if you simply repeat your opening paragraph in your concluding paragraph, which is not what I'm looking for. Here's what Aristotle, in his famous Poetics, said on the form of tragic drama. A whole is what has a beginning and middle and end. A beginning is that which is not a necessary consequent of anything else, but after which something else exists or happens as a natural result. An end, on the contrary, is that which is inevitably, or as a rule, the natural result of something else, but from which nothing else follows. A middle follows something else, and something follows from it. Don't you wish you were a Greek philosopher about 400 BC and you could write this kind of stuff? A beginning does not necessarily follow on something else, but something else follows on the beginning. That is, the middle follows on the beginning and an end follows on the middle. Okay, obvious, but I just thought I should remind you of the fact that I'm looking for a particular structure in an essay. An essay is unified by its topic, the unifying thread of argument, a clearly articulated subject and approach. Now, I got some emails asking me, what's the best way of opening an essay? Here's my chief piece of advice for today. Get directly in your first sentence to your topic. That is, to the author and the text with which you'll be dealing and touching upon how you're going to approach those things. Don't open your essay with vagaries and abstractions, such as, throughout the course of history, human beings have loved each other. Don't do that sort of thing. Get directly to your text. If you open with a series of sentences that present me with what I'm going to call irrelevancies, that is, general observations that don't tell me what your topic is and what text you're dealing with, I will simply draw a line through them and say, abstract, irrelevant, generalities, don't open your essay this way. Get directly to your text, okay? Get to your topic, that is the unifying thread of argument. In this essay, I will argue that the Duke of Ferraro never actually loved the Duchess, but simply wished to possess her. There you go. Introduction of your topic, the chief character or figure you're going to deal with, and an indication of which text it's going to come from. So get to that immediately. An essay, of course, also, and this is absolutely essential, needs to support your opinion with pertinent evidence. And as I've already mentioned, That evidence you will draw from the text with which you are dealing, or the texts with which you are dealing. So what is evidence? Evidence supports your thesis. You defend and you support your thesis through a rallying of textual evidence. The writer's opinion must be defended. What are the two chief ways of defending your opinion? By quoting directly from the text and then analyzing those quotations, pertinent quotations, quotations that actually do what you say they're doing. And then, of course, through paraphrase, which is simply not direct quotation, but a synopsis or a reminder of what the text is saying in your own language as opposed to in its language. Now, I'm going to talk about quotations at great length, not necessarily today, but next Friday. Quotations, of course, are always contained in quotation marks. They appear exactly as they appear in the text, whether that's a work of prose or a work of poetry. And when you cite poetry, there's a specific set of rules for how to do that. And I've provided those on eClass, but I'll talk more about those when we deal with poetry next week as well. Finally, in terms of essay structure, what you want to do is signpost or make effective transitions. When I say signpost, that is indicate to your reader at certain points in the text what it is you're talking about, okay? Tell me where you're taking your argument and perhaps remind me of elements of your argument that you made earlier that you are now going to draw to a conclusion. So making effective transitions, especially between paragraphs. One paragraph should follow another paragraph, even though it introduces a new topic, by suggesting how the two paragraphs are related, okay? So transitions between paragraphs, which are often most successfully achieved by reminding your reader of pertinent points already discussed. The use of the words therefore, then, so, thus, or however, and so on are often good transition words. I'll talk more about that too in just a moment. Okay, the thesis statement. Let's talk about thesis statements. What is the thesis statement? The MLA guidebook gives a lot of good advice on thesis statements that we'll look at in more detail in the coming weeks. But a thesis statement is a statement of argumentative intent. In this essay, I shall argue that. That's a great way to open a thesis statement, at least to yourself. And then when you go back and revise your thesis statement, you can take that out. But the question you need to ask yourself when you say, okay, here's what I want to argue about this text is, what is it? What position am I taking to this text and how will I argue it? That's what a thesis statement does. So it's a matter of opinion, a statement of argumentative intent that tells the reader, and that's me in this case, the overall point of your essay, your opinion, not simply a matter of fact. The thesis statement should be a complete sentence. It could be two sentences, two related sentences that can stand on its own. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of effective and ineffective thesis statements. Now, these are about texts that are unrelated to the text we're reading in this course this year. This is for another course I taught. But I want you to look at these thesis statements, which are my own, and consider why one is effective and why others are not effective. Here's some examples of effective or strong thesis statements. In what follows, I shall argue that Swift's A Modest Proposal, and this is a text we are reading this year, makes effective use of irony to satirize absentee Irish landlords, who the author believes should take primary responsibility for the condition of their starving countrymen. Here's what I like about this thesis statement. It tells me which texts you're going to be dealing with, Swift's A Modest Proposal. It says that you're going to make this particular argument about this text that is implicit in the text, but not necessarily explicitly stated in the text, that the text satirizes absentee Irish landlords, okay? But it uses irony to do this. And we'll be talking about satire and irony before we take up Swift. And it says, this is what this essay is trying to do. And I'm going to demonstrate this to you by a careful reading of the essay. The author, Swift, believes that Irish absentee landlords, landlords who don't actually live on the land that they rent out to starving peasants, should take more responsibility for the farmers who rent their land. Okay, so here's a critical take on the text. It's critical because what it's doing is it is extracting from the text a chief or central point. Okay, here's another example of an effective thesis statement. This is about a short story, Shooting an Elephant. Short stories, short poems, short essays, the title goes in quotation marks. Longer texts, like the 3 novels I've asked you to read this year, are always the titles are either underlined or italicized. Keep this point in mind. Short text, quotation marks go around the title. Longer text, underlined or italicized, not both, one or the other, and I'm happy to accept either. Shooting an Elephant seems initially to simply describe a traumatic event in the life of the author. I love this thesis statement because it's going to say an uncareful or a not very close reading of the story would suggest that this is what it's about. And then the thesis statement takes the form of a compound sentence with a semicolon to indicate the distinction between this first opinion and the second one that's going to be argued. Everyone can see what I'm saying here. This is a complex thesis statement, and I like it because it's essentially 2 related clauses or phrases separated by a semicolon that says, on the one hand, it looks like this, but I'm going to, on the other hand, argue this. And I anticipate that this particular essay will move back and forth between these 2 ways of thinking about the text, arguing chiefly for the second way. So, just to reiterate, Shooting an Elephant seems initially to simply describe a traumatic event in the life of the author. The short story, however, and I like this because it's identifying this text as a particular genre, the short story, however, nice use of that, is predominantly about the crisis of identity that occurs when a white colonial officer is confronted with the reality of his tenuous position in Burmese society. So it's not simply about one event in the author's life, it's about something bigger than that. That particular traumatic event in which George Orwell recollects having to shoot an elephant in must is more than just about the shooting of an elephant. The elephant's death itself represents this complex relationship that George Orwell, as a white representative of British imperial control and authority, it represents a crisis in his identity as a representative of the British Empire. So that is reading this story and extrapolating from a careful reading of the story, a thesis that reads the story as something more complex than it originally appears. Okay, so these are examples of effective thesis statements. Let's look at a couple of examples on the same text of what I would call ineffective or weak or unsatisfactory thesis statements. Here's one example. Swift's modest proposal is a brilliant satirical essay, period. I have no disagreement with this. I do think Swift's modest proposal is a brilliant satirical essay, but this thesis statement doesn't tell me anything that I don't already know about the text, and it doesn't take up, it doesn't develop an opinion or take up a critical relationship to Swift's modest proposal. This is simply an opinion, but offering no support. We might say it's an obvious opinion. Swift's modest proposal is widely recognized as a brilliant satirical essay. The question is, why? What makes it brilliant? What is a satirical essay as opposed to, for example, a merely descriptive essay or a critical essay? What is this genre that's being talked about here? So it's an opinion that offers no support. It doesn't define satire. It is purely descriptive rather than argumentative or analytical. Everyone see what I'm saying here? why this is an ineffective thesis. Here's a second example of an ineffective thesis. Orwell first talks about his insecurities, then kills an elephant. Okay, that's a fairly straightforward plot synopsis, but once again, it is merely descriptive. It's not argumentative. It states the obvious, and in not very sophisticated language, it expresses no opinion, and it provides no support for an opinion. It is simply a statement. Okay, so here, these are just some examples of the difference between strong and weak thesis statements. And I'll develop a few more of these based on the text that we're reading this year and present them to you. Okay. Where do we find a thesis statement? And I think we still all learn this in high school. I don't know, but in a short work, such as the close reading assignment, I look for your thesis at the end of your first paragraph, typically as a standalone sentence. So the thesis statement is generally placed as the last sentence or perhaps two sentences of the first paragraph. Okay, the first sentence of the second paragraph then makes a transition from the thesis to a broader argument. It starts the argument that's going to support the thesis. So that's where I'm looking for your thesis statement. And your opening paragraph, your first paragraph, the opening sentences of your first paragraph should get directly to the material to be discussed. You contextualize the text or the text that you're writing about, suggest perhaps various approaches to that text or possibilities of interpretation, and then gradually focus that opening paragraph, like the inverted triangle we all learned about in high school, into a thesis statement. So you move from the general, the introduction of the text, to the specific, the argument about the text. Once again, I realize this is not necessarily exciting material to be reminded of, but after today, I'm going to expect us all to be on the same page with regard to this. Let's just think about how the essay needs to appear on the page for when you submit it to me. Just a few important formal elements, and then I'm going to switch to the MLA. Okay. You do not need a cover page for any of the assignments you write me this year. Okay, so you do not need a separate cover page, but you do need this essential information on your first page in the top left-hand corner. And this is just a reminder. I know you know all this, but sometimes students give me essays and they forget to put this information on. So your name should be at the top left corner. Perhaps your student ID, don't worry about that. I'm not worried about your student ID. The course title and number, English 102 D15. My name, preferably spelled correctly, Professor Peter Cinema. And then the due date of the assignment. Although I'm not too worried about that. What I want is your name, course title and number, and my name. That's essential information at the top left-hand corner of your opening page. And then centered, double-spaced right after that. And all essays need to be double-spaced, and that includes your works cited, okay? And indented quotations, everything is double-spaced, 12-point font. My preferred font is Times New Roman, but you're welcome to use any font that you find most appealing, but typically Times New Roman, which is what you see here, 12-point font, no bigger, no smaller, double spaced throughout. Okay, your title. The title of your essay, and I do want titles for all assignments this year, should be top centered on your first page, 2 spaces above your first paragraph. Okay, and since your essay will be double spaced throughout, including indented quotations and works cited, that means that the title will be spaced the same distance from the first line of your text as subsequent lines are separated from each other. And there are effective and ineffective titles. And I want to talk just for a second about this. The title should indicate the text that you're going to deal with and the topic of your essay. Here's some poor titles. George Orwell shooting an elephant. That's not a title. That's the title of George Orwell's story. That's not a title of your essay. Or essay topic number 3, that's also an insufficient or an inadequate title. Proper titles indicate to me the topic that you're going to address in a few tightly packed, terse words. I do like titles with colons because that can indicate, well, I'll show you. Orwell's Colonial Anxieties in Shooting an Elephant. I like this title. You're going to deal with that text and you're going to deal with this topic. And you're going to argue that Orwell's Shooting an Elephant exhibits certain anxieties about colonialism. Okay, that's a good title. Here's another good title. Swift and the Question of Absentee Landlords, colon, I like that, a critical reading of a modest proposal. These are examples of strong titles. These are examples of weak titles. Please keep in mind, and the title is the last thing you might choose to put in your paper. First, you want to make your argument, and then you go back to your argument and say, this is what my argument's about, and make that your title. Okay, but a title should indicate your topic. It should be a mini version of your thesis statement, perhaps. Okay. If there are any questions, please do jump in. Okay, page numbering. How often students forget to paginate their pages. Will you lose grades for not numbering your pages? No, not in your first assignment, and perhaps not even in your second assignment, but it's a minor annoyance to me. I like to be able to refer back to the pages of your essay when I'm commenting on it. And I can't do that if you don't give me page numbers. I prefer page numbers in the top right-hand corner, but if you choose to put your page numbers bottom center, that's fine. Just make sure that you number your pages. Your first page, the one that contains the information at the top, your title and your opening paragraphs, that's page number 1. You can suppress the page number on page number 1 if you want, but I also don't mind if there is a page number in the top right. In any case, the second page of your essay should have the number 2 on it, not the number 1 on it. Okay, so number your pages. Your first page should not contain a page number. Don't worry about it if it does. I'm not too worried about that, but all subsequent pages, including your works cited, which is on a separate page at the end of your essay, and I'll get to that in just a few minutes, should be consecutively numbered in the top right-hand corner. Okay, just a few more general stylistic points, and then I'm going to just go to a sample essay provided for us in the MLA and just run through it for a moment. Text titles. The titles of every text you cite must be either underlined or italicized for longer poems, and we're not dealing with any long poems this year, so don't worry about that, but certainly for all novels, for full-length books and for plays and for any longer text, for example, or surrounded by quotation marks. Short stories, monos and domenos, should be surrounded by quotation marks when you cite the title. Shorter poems, both My Last Duchess and Elegy in a Country Courtyard, in a country churchyard, should be surrounded by quotation marks. Swift's Modest Proposal should be surrounded by quotation marks. Essays and articles and so on always.
My bad. I'll call you back, okay?
Could you please put on your mute, Soraya? Soraya, excuse me. So George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, that's correct. Short story, quotation marks, can be found in W.H. New and W.E. Messenger's editors of this particular volume, Literature in English. That is italicized. Text is italicized. The short story contained in it is in quotation marks. Just a quick note on slang or everyday usage. Your essays are formal pieces of writing. Avoid using language that is inappropriate to the text, anachronistic language, contemporary or present day slang. Always use a formal language as appropriate to the text you're dealing with. Avoid conversational English, the kind of language you use with your friends at the pub, in favor of formal language. And that includes avoiding certain condensations. Always would not wouldn't. He had rather than he'd. I have rather than I, and so on. And avoid common forms of speaking. Swift thinks is really cool. None of you use that anymore. That dates me. They loved each other like crazy, and so on. Avoid colloquialisms and anachronisms, and always employ as formal a language as you can, okay? And do remember this, the possessive, remember the proper use of the apostrophe when denominating the possessive, that is ownership, okay? The it exception, the possessive is never denominated with an apostrophe. Its numerous parts, the parts that belong to it are with this word, of course, no apostrophe. This is a reminder, I know you all know this, but I'm just reminding you of this. Singular ownership, the boat's rudder, the nation's poverty. The apostrophe goes there, of course, between the T and the S, between the N and the S, and with plural or group ownership, the gentlemen's club, the apostrophe comes after the S, or the various authors' dilemmas, more than one author, the apostrophe comes after the S. Those are just little stylistic reminders. Okay, I'm going to click off now my document here and just this is available in one of the URL documents that I put under week 3. If you go to eClass, there's a whole series of brief documents outlining expectations for MLA style and formatting that are included in the MLA handbook that I've given you a URL to now at the top of eClass. This is what an essay should look like. This is where we'll conclude for today. But go and look at this document under week 3 of eClass. I hope all of you can see this. Maybe I can make it a little bit larger. Okay, here's the first page. And there's all these useful little boxes that tell you what's going on here. So here's the essential information included in the top left: the student's name, the professor's name, the course number, and the due date. Okay, so here's the information that's required in the top left. Notice that this page is numbered. This is number 1. Someone has implanted a header here with their last name. You don't need to do this, but you're welcome to do this. All I'm looking for is a number, but if you want to use the running header that has your name, that's just fine, as long as the page number is up there, okay? The green boxes explain MLA format, and the blue boxes contain directions for writing and citing in MLA style. Here's the title. Notice that it's 2 spaces below this introductory information, and it's 2 spaces above the beginning of the actual essay. So everything is double spaced. Notice that the title, of course, functions as an appropriate title toward a recovery of 19th century farming handbooks. Okay, so this is obviously going to be an essay that is going to recover or resuscitate or rediscover these peculiar 19th century books called farming handbooks. Let's have just a quick look at the first paragraph. Okay, so titles are centered and written in 12-point font. Let's just look at the first paragraph and see if it's a successful first paragraph. While researching texts written about 19th century farming, I found a few authors. I like this. Here's the author inserting herself into the text and saying, as a result of my research, this is what I discovered. I found a few authors who published books about the literature of 19th century farming, particularly agricultural journals, newspapers, pamphlets, and brochures. Notice how this introductory sentence introduces, but in a sort of general way, the genre with which the essay is going to deal. I was doing this and I found these curious texts. Now we're going to hone in on what aspect of these texts the author is planning to deal with in this essay. These authors often placed the farming literature they were studying, excuse me, into an historical context by discussing the important events in agriculture of the year in which the literature was published. And then here, and we're going to get into these in-text citations in more detail in future weeks. See Desmarais, for example. I'm going to find Desmarais in the work cited at the end of this paper. Let's just make sure that it's actually there. Go down to, there's some notes. We're not going to be using notes necessarily. Here's the work cited. Let me make sure, there is Desmarais. So see Desmarais. If I want to know more about what those texts do, I'll go to this author. Desmarais, Albert Lowther, and we're going to be coming to proper proper citation techniques next week. The American Agricultural Press, 1819 to 1860, Columbia University Press, published in 1941. So now I know what that references to, that in-text citation is to this text, and this is where I need to turn if I want to learn more about these farming texts, the American Agricultural Press. So there it is. Everyone see what happened there? Okay. However, I like this. So there's a kind of transition in the middle of the opening paragraph. These books seem to be doing this thing. However, while these authors discuss journals, newspapers, pamphlets, and brochures, all these different genres, I could not find much discussion about another important source of farming knowledge. I like the use of the colon here. Farming handbooks. My goal in this paper, so here's the thesis statement. My goal. A thesis statement articulates your goal, right? What my argument will be this, and I'm going to make this argument in this particular way. That's what a thesis statement does. My goal in this paper is to bring this source into the agricultural literature discussion by connecting 3 agricultural handbooks from the 19th century with 19th century agricultural history. It's a strong thesis because what it does is it says, I'm going to do something in this essay. I'm going to bring 3 examples of this particular subgenre, farming handbooks, into a bigger conversation with other texts about 19th century farming. I'm going to rediscover the importance of these texts to this field. Now, I'm asking you to do something rather different in English 102, but that is, I'm not asking you to rediscover new kinds of texts, but to argue something from the texts that are on our reading list and that you've read for this year. But here we have then a fine example of what an introductory paragraph does. It moves from an immediate introduction of the general to a specific argument about what's going to be made about those texts. Okay, and then the author goes on. Notice the connection between one paragraph and another. To achieve this goal, what goal? By connecting these 3 agricultural handbooks. This goal is a nice transitional gesture that points back to this thesis statement, but also moves on from it. I have organized my paper to 4 main sections, 2 of which have subsections. I don't advise that you divide the essays you write for me this year into sections and subsections. Especially in short papers, I think that's uncalled for. But often the examples of papers you get in the MLA handbook divide the essays into sections. You don't necessarily have to do that. In fact, I advise against it. So if your paper is long, you may want to write about how your paper is organized. But this is a longer paper than the one I'm asking you to write. Okay, so this is what an essay looks like according to MLA format. This is the kind of thing I anticipate seeing from you. And I'll just remind you that every page is numbered. There's 1 margins on every side. Don't worry too much about measuring your margins. Just use your tab key and your basic settings in Word, and it will format it for you like this. Your paragraphs should be, the first sentence of your paragraph should be tabbed right, by 1 tab, however many spaces that is, 7 or whatever it is, Word documents tab them. There should be no additional space between paragraphs. Everything is double spaced. And this is where I'll conclude for today because I'm running out of time. You will have your works cited page as a separate page at the end of your essay. If you're only citing 1 text, and that's all I expect you to cite, especially in your first close reading assignment, it will simply be work cited, and that will be centered 2 spaces above the actual entries for the text that you put in your work cited, which is what we'll get to next Friday. Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you all. I'm going to stop my screen share for just a moment here. Wish you all a great weekend. If any of you need to stick around with any particular questions, I'll hang around with you after class for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you all on Monday's lecture, having read the 2 poems and have them in front of you for a discussion of those 2 wonderful texts. Thanks, everybody. See you Monday.